It was a quiet evening in the city. The streets were alive but not crowded, the kind of night where people walked slower, enjoying the cool air and the faint sound of cars passing by. The street lights gave everything a soft orange glow, and the smell of roasted coffee drifted from the cafe on the corner. A man named Ethan stepped out of that cafe, carrying nothing but calmness on his face. He wasn't young, maybe in his early 40s, with short hair and a steady walk. His clothes were simple, a dark jacket, jeans, and a black watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. There was something about the way he carried himself, something quiet but strong, like he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had just finished catching up with an old friend and was heading back to his car parked a few blocks away. The night felt peaceful, but that peace didn't last long. A police car slowly pulled over to the side of the street, its headlights washing over the sidewalk. Ethan looked up, surprised for a moment. One of the officers inside rolled down the window. The man behind the wheel had sharp eyes and a smirk that didn't quite reach them. "Evening," the officer said, stepping out of the car. "Mind stopping for a quick word?" Ethan nodded, polite as always. "Sure, what's the matter, officer?" "Routine check," the cop said smoothly. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity in the area. Mind showing some ID?" Ethan reached into his jacket slowly and handed over his driver's license. The officer looked it over, his gaze falling to Ethan's wrist. That watch, and it was unlike any ordinary piece. It had a solid metal body, engraved with small marks and a faint emblem. It looked expensive, yes, but it also looked meaningful. "That's a nice watch," the officer said. "Where'd you get it?" "It was a gift," Ethan replied simply. "Gift, huh?" The officer tilted his head. "That's not something you see every day. You sure it's yours?" Ethan smiled lightly. "Pretty sure. It's been with me a long time." The officer's tone shifted slightly. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Ethan hesitated for a moment. "I'd rather not hand it over. It's personal." That answer didn't sit well with the cop. His smirk faded, replaced by a colder look. "Relax, I'm not asking to keep it. Just making sure it's not part of any stolen property case." Ethan's calm expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They focused sharply for a second. "There's no case, officer. You have my ID, that should be enough." The officer stared at him for a long moment as if trying to decide something. Finally, he spoke again. "Wait right here." He walked back to his car and spoke into his radio. His voice was low, but the tone was deliberate, like he was trying to make something sound official. Ethan stood quietly, watching. He could feel the situation turning, though he couldn't quite tell where it would go. Within minutes, another patrol car pulled up, and two more officers got out. The first one, and the one who had stopped him, seemed to be leading the scene now. "Sir," he said, putting on a false professional tone, "you match the description of a suspect involved in a local theft case. We're going to need to verify your belongings." People walking nearby started slowing down. A few glanced over, curious. One person pulled out their phone, recording from a distance. Ethan sighed quietly. "This seems unnecessary. I've done nothing wrong." "Then you have nothing to worry about," the officer said, stepping closer. "Now hand over the watch." Ethan didn't move. "You already checked my ID. You can call it in." "There's no record on me," the officer smirked again. "We'll decide that." He extended his hand, palm up, waiting. For a few seconds, neither man moved. The air between them grew heavy. Ethan could see the greed in the officer's eyes now. It wasn't about any stolen item. This man just wanted what he saw. Ethan's voice stayed calm but firm. "I'm not giving you my watch." The officer's jaw tightened. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" "I'm refusing a false one," Ethan said quietly. One of the other officers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. But the first cop, the one in charge, didn't back off. He stepped closer, almost chest to chest with Ethan now. "Put your hands behind your back." Ethan didn't argue. He knew how fast things could go wrong in situations like this. Without resistance, he turned slightly and placed his hands behind him. The officer cuffed him roughly and pulled the watch from his wrist. "Evidence," he muttered. Ethan looked him straight in the eye. "You just made a mistake." The officer ignored him, waving at his partners. "We'll take him to the station for questioning." The crowd nearby murmured. Someone shouted, "He didn't do anything!" Another voice said, "I'm recording this." But the officers didn't care. They led Ethan to the patrol car and pushed him inside. As the car drove through the quiet streets, Ethan stared out the window, silent. His mind wasn't racing, it was calculating. Every turn, every word, every move the officer had made was already stored in his memory. Years of training had taught him not to panic, not to react emotionally. He had been in worse situations before, in places where one wrong breath could cost him everything. But something about this was different. It wasn't danger, it was disappointment. He could tell the man driving the car wasn't new to this. The way he carried himself, the smooth tone, the fake professionalism, it all spoke of someone who had done things like this before. Someone who knew how to twist power into personal gain. When they arrived at the station, the officer led him inside, still holding the watch. He told the desk clerk that Ethan was a possible suspect in a theft case. The clerk barely looked up, just nodded and waved them through. It was routine. Ethan sat down on a bench in a small holding room, his hands now free but his expression unreadable. The officer leaned against the doorway, spinning the watch on his finger. "You know," the officer said, "you don't seem too worried." Ethan looked up at him. "Should I be?" "Most people in your position start talking fast," the officer said. "Trying to explain, trying to make deals. You, though, you're calm. Why is that?" Ethan's reply was soft but steady. "Because I know how this ends," the officer chuckled. "Oh yeah? How's that?" Ethan's eyes met his. "With the truth," the officer smirked, tapping the watch against his palm. "We'll see about that." He turned and walked away, leaving Ethan alone. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Ethan leaned back, eyes half closed, as if resting. But he wasn't resting. He was thinking about every word that had been said, about the cameras in the cafe that might have caught the initial stop, about the people recording on the street. Evidence always existed. You just had to know where to find it. Minutes turned into an hour. The station was quiet except for the faint hum of lights and the occasional voice from another room. Then the same officer returned. He tossed Ethan's ID on the table but kept the watch. "All right," he said casually. "Seems like you check out. Must have been a mix-up." Ethan said nothing. "Paperwork's gonna take a bit," the officer added, pretending to be kind now. "You can wait here." Ethan nodded once. The officer turned to leave, but Ethan spoke again. "Officer?" The man stopped. "That watch means more than you think," Ethan said quietly. "You should take care of it." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I will." As soon as he left the room, Ethan exhaled slowly. His expression didn't change, but the patience in his eyes deepened. He knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with, someone who thought power was protection. But Ethan wasn't an ordinary man. He had learned long ago that the strongest weapon wasn't force or fear, it was control. And right now, he had more control than the officer realized. The night outside the station grew darker, but inside, a quiet storm was forming. Ethan waited, still and composed, knowing this was only the beginning. In that stillness, one thing was certain. The officer had picked the wrong man to steal from. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the old fluorescent light above. Ethan sat still, his hands resting calmly on the table. He could hear footsteps outside, the low hum of conversation, the occasional ring of a phone at the front desk. Everything about the police station felt ordinary, but the man sitting in it was far from ordinary. He had been in holding rooms before, but never like this. This time he wasn't a suspect, he was a target. The officer who took his watch thought he had power, but power without discipline always collapsed on itself. Ethan had seen it too many times, both in battlefields and boardrooms. The type never changed, only the uniform did. The door opened and the same officer stepped in again, carrying a clipboard. His voice was smooth, too relaxed, like he was trying to act casual. "So Ethan, right?" he said. "I've got your ID cleared. Looks like everything's clean. You'll probably be out soon. Just need to verify a few more things." Ethan didn't answer. He simply watched the man's eyes. They told the truth, his mouth didn't. The officer shifted a little, pretending to glance through papers. "You work around here?" "Not really," Ethan replied softly. "I move around." The officer nodded like he didn't care about the answer. He was buying time, stalling. He wanted to make sure Ethan didn't ask for the watch back just yet. Finally, Ethan said, "You still have my property." The officer looked up, pretending not to understand. "Your property?" "The watch," Ethan said. "Oh, that," the officer said lightly. "It's in evidence now. We'll return it once the paperwork's done." Procedure, you know, Ethan nodded slowly. Procedure, he repeated. The officer gave him a fake smile. You're free to wait here or head home if you like. I'll make sure it's logged properly. Ethan stood. I'll wait. The officer hesitated for a second. He didn't expect that answer. All right then. Suit yourself. He left the room quickly, shutting the door behind him. Ethan sat back down, his calm never breaking. Waiting was easy for him. Patience was something he had learned long ago. The kind of patience that could outlast fear, greed, or arrogance. He leaned back, looking at the small camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It blinked red every few seconds. He knew what kind of system it was. Cheap, basic, but enough to record everything in the room. He made sure to stay visible in its frame. Meanwhile, in the other office, the officer placed Ethan's watch on his desk. He looked at it under the yellow light. It wasn't just valuable, it was rare. There was a small engraving on the back, faint but clear enough to read, "Honor above all." He muttered to himself, "Must be military." He smiled and spun it once on the table. He told himself it was just a small thing no one would notice. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. It was only the first time it would come back to bite. A younger officer knocked on the door. "Everything okay, sir?" "Fine," the older one said quickly. "Just finishing paperwork." The younger man nodded and walked off. The night dragged on. Hours passed. Ethan stayed silent, unmoving, like he was waiting for something. Around midnight, another officer came in. A man in his late 20s, polite, tired, clearly not part of whatever game was going on. "Hey," he said softly. "You've been here for a while. Did they tell you what's happening?" "Not really," Ethan said. "They said they're verifying something." The younger officer frowned. "That's strange. You were brought in for a theft check, right? That shouldn't take this long." Ethan gave him a calm look. "Maybe you can help me. The officer who brought me in kept my watch. Said it was evidence." The young man's face changed slightly. "Evidence? For what case?" Ethan shook his head. He didn't say. The young officer stood there for a few seconds, uneasy. "I'll check." He left the room quickly. Ethan knew what would happen next: confusion, whispers, and eventually realization. It always followed the same pattern. Corruption never hid perfectly. It only hoped no one would look too closely. In the hallway, the young officer checked the logbook. There was no entry under Ethan's name. No record of seized items, no paperwork, nothing. His stomach tightened. He walked toward the senior officer's office and knocked. "Sir, did you log the item you took from the suspect?" The older man didn't look up. "Working on it," the younger one frowned. "It's not in the system." "Then wait until it is," the older man said sharply. "Don't worry about it." The younger officer left, but something about the tone didn't sit right. He returned to the holding room. Ethan was still there, calm as ever. "Sir," he said quietly, "your name's not in our system yet. There's no report filed." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." He stood, his calmness making the young man pause. "Where are you going?" "Home," Ethan said. "They said I was free to go." The young officer didn't stop him. Something about Ethan's steady voice made him step aside. As Ethan walked out of the station, the younger man looked down the hall toward his superior's office. He had a feeling this wasn't over. Outside, the cold air hit Ethan's face, but it felt good and clean. He stood near the station entrance for a moment, watching the quiet street. Then he turned and started walking, his pace steady, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't angry. Anger was a waste of energy. What he felt was something else. A quiet determination. The kind that moved like water, patient but unstoppable. He walked a few blocks and stopped under a streetlight. Pulling out his phone, he opened a secure app, the kind only a few people knew existed. With a few taps, he sent a short message. Unit 47, verification request. Local precinct, possible misconduct. Need data pull. The message went out silently. Within minutes, his phone buzzed once, confirmation received. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. He had done this before, many times in different cities under different covers. Sometimes he was there to watch, sometimes to test, and sometimes, like tonight, to expose. By the time he reached home, the street was empty. He unlocked his small apartment and walked straight to his desk. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began typing notes. Times, faces, actions, everything that happened. His reports were always clear, never emotional. Just the truth, but one line at the end stood out. Something he added for himself. Arrogance hides in plain sight until it meets someone who isn't afraid to stand still. The next morning, the officer came into the station wearing his usual confident look. He placed Ethan's watch in his desk drawer, planning to handle it later. But before he could even pour his first cup of coffee, two men in suits walked through the front doors. They didn't look like locals. They flashed badges and federal ones. Internal Affairs, one of them said calmly. "We're here to review an incident from last night." The officer froze, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Incident?" "Routine procedure," the agent said. "We'll need access to your logs and security footage." He nodded quickly. Of course. As they began reviewing files, his hands trembled slightly. He told himself it was fine, that maybe it wasn't about him. But deep down, he knew. At that same moment, Ethan sat in a small diner across the street, sipping coffee by the window. He could see the station clearly from where he sat. He wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet look of satisfaction on his face. Not because he'd caught someone, but because the system still worked, even if slowly. The waitress poured him another cup and said, "Long night?" Ethan nodded. "Something like that." He sat there for a while, watching the morning traffic, the city waking up again, unaware of what was unfolding across the street. To anyone else, he was just another man having breakfast. But for him, this was just another mission, one where justice didn't need guns or violence, just patience and truth. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, and stood. Before leaving, he glanced once more at the station. He didn't need to go back. Things were already in motion. He stepped outside into the sunlight, calm as ever. Some battles he knew didn't need to be fought in the open. They only needed the right moment. And that moment had just begun. Morning sunlight poured through the blinds of the small diner, casting warm stripes across the table where Ethan sat. The coffee in front of him had gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on the police station across the street. He could see the movement inside through the glass doors. People rushing, voices raised, a tension that hadn't been there last night. He had seen this kind of situation unfold many times before. It always started quietly. The ones who thought they could get away with small things never expected anyone to watch closely. But someone always did. He stood, left a few bills on the table, and walked out into the street. The air was crisp and the city felt alive. Across the road, a few people were gathering near the entrance of the station, whispering among themselves. Something was definitely happening inside. Ethan crossed the street, calm and steady, not rushing but not hesitating either. When he entered the station, heads turned slightly. Some recognized him from the night before. The young officer who had spoken to him earlier looked up from his desk, eyes widening in surprise. "You're back," the younger man said. "I left something behind." Ethan replied quietly. Before the young man could respond, two men in suits walked out from the hallway, the same agents who had arrived earlier that morning. One of them stopped when he saw Ethan. "Mr. Cole," the agent said, lowering his voice. "Didn't expect you to come in person." "Just Ethan," he replied simply. "I thought it would be easier to clear a few things face to face." The agent nodded slightly, understanding. "We've already started reviewing the tapes and evidence. Looks like your instincts were right again." Ethan said nothing. He followed them into a small office. The same officer from last night, the one who had taken the watch, sat there, his face pale, his hands on the table. Gone was the arrogance from before. He looked tired, nervous, maybe even scared. The agent spoke calmly. "We're conducting an internal review regarding an incident involving possible misconduct. You were the responding officer last night, correct?" The man nodded stiffly. "Yes, but it was a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" The agent repeated, raising an eyebrow. The officer swallowed hard. The man matched the suspect's description. "I followed standard protocol." "Interesting," the agent said. "Because according to the footage, you didn't log any report. You didn't enter any ID into the system, and you didn't file any evidence. Would you like to explain why?" The room went quiet. The man shifted in his seat. Ethan stood silently in the corner, watching, not saying a word. The officer finally spoke, his voice low. "I was going to handle it later. It was late and I was tired. I made a mistake." The agent's tone stayed calm but firm. "Mistakes happen. But this isn't just a mistake. You detained a citizen without cause and confiscated personal property without proper record. That's not procedure. The officer tried to defend himself, but his words stumbled. I didn't mean... I thought maybe... Ethan finally spoke, his voice even and quiet. You thought I wouldn't say anything. The officer's head turned sharply toward him. For a second there was recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they completely misjudged another person. Ethan continued. You didn't see me as someone who'd stand up to you. You saw a quiet man walking alone wearing something you wanted. That was your mistake. The officer looked down, saying nothing. The agent turned to Ethan. We'll handle it from here. You've done your part. Ethan nodded and stepped out of the room. As he walked down the hall, the younger officer approached him again, looking uneasy. Sir, he said quietly. I didn't know what was going on last night. I'm sorry. Ethan looked at him, his tone calm. You did what you thought was right. That's what matters. The young man nodded slowly, still looking troubled. Is he going to lose his job? Ethan sighed. That depends on what kind of man he really is. Sometimes losing a job isn't the worst thing that can happen. Sometimes it's what wakes you up. He walked toward the exit, but before leaving he turned back slightly. Take care of how you wear that badge. It means more than you think. Outside, the city noise seemed louder now. Cars, people, a world that kept moving no matter what happened behind closed doors. Ethan walked down the street, his steps steady, his eyes on the horizon. Later that afternoon, he found himself sitting by the river, a quiet spot he liked when he needed to think. The water shimmered in the sunlight, and a few kids were throwing stones near the edge. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. His watch was still missing, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what it stood for. It wasn't just metal and glass. It was a reminder of people he'd served with, of promises made in harder times. It was a symbol of loyalty and trust, things money couldn't buy. After a while, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw a message. Case recorded. Officer suspended pending investigation. Item recovered. He smiled faintly. That was enough. Later that evening, he received another message from an unknown number. You were one of them, weren't you? Military? Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Once. Not anymore. The reply came seconds later. You never really stopped being one of them. Ethan didn't respond. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and watched the river again. He knew the message wasn't random. The people he'd worked with before always had their ways of checking in, quietly from a distance. As night fell, he headed home. On his way, he stopped by a small store to grab some groceries. The man behind the counter greeted him warmly. Haven't seen you around in a few days, the shopkeeper said. Been busy, Ethan replied with a small smile. The shopkeeper laughed. Aren't we all? You seem like a man who's always busy with something important. Ethan didn't answer, just smiled politely. Something like that. When he got back to his apartment, he placed the groceries on the counter and sat by the window. The city lights twinkled below, and far in the distance the police station sign glowed faintly. He thought about the officer, not with anger, but with a quiet curiosity. What made a man like that lose his way? Was it greed, desperation, or just the slow fading of integrity over time? He'd seen it happen before, not only in police forces, but in every place where power met temptation. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The world wasn't full of good or bad people, he believed. It was full of choices, moments that defined who you really were. The next morning he woke early and went for a walk through the park. The air was cool, filled with the smell of wet grass. Birds were scattered across the trees, and joggers passed by with friendly nods. For the first time in days, he felt peace. Halfway through the walk, his phone buzzed again. A new message appeared. Recovered item available for collection. Contact IA desk. He made his way back to the station, arriving just after noon. The atmosphere inside was different now, quieter, more respectful. The young officer from before greeted him at the counter. They said you could pick this up, he said, handing over a small sealed bag. Inside was the watch, clean, polished, the same faint engraving still shining on the back. Ethan took it carefully and nodded. Thank you. As he turned to leave, the young man spoke again. Sir, can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you just report him last night? You could have caused a scene. You could have fought back. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then said quietly, because sometimes the best way to win is to let the other person show who they really are. The young officer nodded slowly, thinking about the answer. Ethan smiled faintly and walked out into the sunlight. He slipped the watch back on his wrist, the familiar weight grounding him again. As he walked down the steps, he thought about how strange life could be, how a simple evening could turn into something much bigger, and how sometimes justice came quietly. Without shouting, without violence, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The city stretched before him, full of stories, full of people trying to do the right thing, and others learning what that meant. Ethan walked on, disappearing into the rhythm of the crowd, his steps steady and sure, the faint ticking of his watch matching the beat of his heart. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The day after Ethan got his watch back, the city felt different. It wasn't just another morning. There was a quiet sense of balance returning, as if something that had been tilted was now set right again. But for Ethan, it wasn't about winning or proving anything. It was about finishing what had started. He sat by his window with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunlight move slowly across the buildings. The watch on his wrist caught the light and glimmered faintly. It was more than just a timepiece, and it was a reminder of who he was, of everything he had stood for. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from one of the internal agents he had met at the station. Update. Investigation still active. Officer under review. Command request short debrief. Ethan read it carefully, took one last sip of coffee, and then put on his jacket. He never liked meetings, but he understood their importance. The truth always needed to be set down properly, not just for justice, but for the record. When he arrived at the station, the atmosphere was heavy. Officers moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. Whispers drifted between desks, and everyone knew something serious was happening behind the closed doors of the captain's office. The young officer who had helped him before greeted him near the entrance. "They're waiting for you," he said softly. "Upstairs," Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Inside the small meeting room, the two agents from before sat with files spread out in front of them. The senior one gestured for Ethan to take a seat. "We appreciate your cooperation," the agent began. What happened here opened up more than one problem. It seems this wasn't the first complaint against him. "Yours just gave us the final piece." Ethan listened quietly. The agent continued. "We've reviewed body cam footage, reports, and witness statements. It's clear he's been running small extortion tricks for months, shaking down people, taking valuables, pretending it was part of an investigation." The other agent leaned forward. "Your calm reaction helped us get this far. Most people would have lost their temper or walked away. You stayed collected, and that made the difference." Ethan nodded slightly but said nothing. Praise never sat well with him. He didn't do what he did for credit. The agent closed the file and asked, "If you don't mind, we'd like to understand your background a little better. You handled this situation like someone with experience." Ethan's eyes flicked up briefly. "Let's just say I've worked in environments where patience mattered more than power." The agent smiled faintly. "Fair enough." After a short debrief, Ethan stood and shook their hands. "You'll get your full report by tomorrow," he said. As he stepped out of the room, the air in the hallway felt lighter. The officer's desk, the corrupt one, was empty now. His nameplate was gone, the drawers cleared out. Ethan paused for a moment, staring at the empty space. There was no satisfaction, only a quiet reflection. The young officer appeared again, carrying a few papers. "He's gone," he said softly. "I figured," Ethan replied. "They said he's suspended without pay. Might face charges later." Ethan nodded. "He'll have time to think." The young man hesitated, then asked, "How did you stay so calm that night? I mean, anyone else would have fought back." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "Because anger doesn't fix anything. It only blinds you. And I've been blinded before. Once was enough." The young man didn't know what to say. Ethan gave him a small nod and walked out into the sunlight. Outside, the day had warmed. The city moved on, cars honking, people crossing streets, children laughing near the park. Life never stopped for long, that was the beauty of it. Ethan walked slowly, feeling the steady rhythm of the world around him. He stopped by a small park bench and sat down. For a while he just listened, birds chirping, leaves rustling, distant chatter. Peace wasn't a big moment. It was small things like this. As he sat there, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Ethan?" a voice asked, deep and calm. "Who's this?" "An old friend," the voice said. Heard about what happened. You're still cleaning up messes, huh? Ethan recognized the tone now. It was someone from his old unit, a man he hadn't spoken to in years. Some habits don't die easy, he said. The voice chuckled softly. You never did like leaving things unfinished. What do you need? Ethan asked. Not me, the man said. There's someone else who could use your help. Similar situation. Different uniform, Ethan sighed. I'm not in that world anymore. You were never out of it, the man replied. You just stepped aside for a while. Think about it. You've got the kind of mind that sees through the cracks, the kind people like us still need. There was a pause. Ethan looked out across the park, watching a child chase a balloon that had slipped from her hand. After a long moment, he said, Send me the details. The call ended, and Ethan sat there quietly, feeling the weight of what might come next. Later that evening, he went home and placed his watch on the table. He stared at it for a while, remembering the inscription, Honor above all. He touched the metal lightly and whispered, Still learning to live by that. Then he opened his laptop. A secure file had already arrived, encrypted with a familiar code. He typed in a short password, and the screen came to life with a list of documents, reports, photos, and names. It looked like a small-town department, same story, different faces. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The same pattern repeated everywhere. People with power forgetting what it was for. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But it still needed to be dealt with. He sent a short message to his contact. I'll look into it. The reply came seconds later. Knew you would. He closed the laptop and stared out the window. The city lights glowed softly, and somewhere in the distance sirens wailed. Not urgent, just part of the usual noise of life. For a long while, Ethan sat in silence. Then he stood, walked to the sink and washed his hands slowly, letting the cold water run. He looked at his reflection in the window, the same calm eyes, the same steady expression. But behind them was a man who had seen too much, done too much, and still believed there was a right way to do things. He turned off the light, picked up his watch, and slipped it back onto his wrist. The familiar weight made him feel centered again. Before going to bed, he wrote in his notebook, something he did after every mission, no matter how small. Corruption isn't just theft or lies. It's forgetting the reason you wear the uniform. And sometimes, the only way to remind the world is to stay silent until the truth speaks for itself. He closed the notebook, placed it on the table, and sat for a while longer, listening to the quiet hum of the city. Somewhere out there, another story was starting. Another fight that didn't need fists or fury, just patience and conviction. When he finally lay down, the night outside was still. His eyes stayed open for a few minutes, watching the shadows on the ceiling. The world had its share of chaos, but there were still people trying to fix it, one quiet step at a time. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a while, he slept without tension. Tomorrow would bring something new, it always did. But tonight there was peace. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him knew that peace never lasted long. A few weeks passed, and life began to fall into its usual rhythm again. The city seemed calmer now, as if the tension that had once hung in the air had faded. Ethan spent his mornings walking through the park, greeting the same faces, watching the same people rush off to work. The world moved on quietly, but inside, he knew his own journey wasn't finished yet. The message from his old friend had stayed on his mind. Every day he thought about it, wondering if he should get involved or let it go. He had promised himself that he was done with anything connected to law enforcement or conflict. But when he looked around and at the people just trying to live honest lives, he knew some things couldn't be ignored. One afternoon, as he sat in a small cafe near the train station, his phone buzzed again. It was a new message from the same contact, small town, officer harassing locals, not violent but using his badge for favors. You're the only one I trust to handle this quietly. Ethan looked at the screen for a long moment, then typed a short reply, Send me the address. A few seconds later, another message appeared with the details of a town 2 hours away. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked out. The road to the town was long and winding, surrounded by dry fields and old wooden fences. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and outsiders stood out quickly. Ethan parked near a small diner on the main street and stepped out. The air smelled of dust and gasoline. He sat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee. The woman behind the counter gave him a polite smile. "You're not from around here," she said kindly. "Just passing through," Ethan replied. "Be careful," she said in a quiet tone, leaning closer. "We've had some trouble lately. A few people got their cars towed for no reason. Some say it's the new officer trying to make extra money." Ethan nodded, pretending to be uninterested. "That so?" "Yeah," she said, sighing. "He's got a mean streak, too. Folks here don't know what to do. He's supposed to protect us, but it feels like we need protection from him." Ethan thanked her, paid for the coffee, and walked outside. He leaned against his car for a moment, watching the street. Everything about the place felt too quiet, like people were walking on eggshells. He spent the next hour observing. People avoided the police station, glancing nervously when a patrol car drove by. It didn't take long for him to spot the man causing the problem. The officer was tall, wearing sunglasses, acting as if the street belonged to him. He stopped a young man on a bicycle, spoke harshly, and then confiscated the bike without reason. Ethan watched carefully, noting his behavior. It was the same arrogance he had seen before, the kind that came from power with no balance. Later that evening, Ethan checked into a small motel on the edge of town. The manager, an older man with kind eyes, gave him the keys and said softly, "You picked a strange time to visit. People are scared these days." Ethan smiled slightly. Sometimes fear needs company before it leaves. That night he walked near the police station. The officer's car was parked outside, lights off, engine running. Ethan stayed in the shadows waiting. After a while, the officer came out carrying a small bag. He looked around before putting it in his trunk. It wasn't hard to guess what was inside. Valuables. Maybe things he had taken during the day. Ethan took a quiet photo of the scene, then walked away before the man noticed. The next morning, he went back to the diner. The same woman was there, and when she saw him, she smiled faintly. "You're still here." "Just for a bit longer," he said. "You said people were scared. Why hasn't anyone reported him?" She shook her head. "They tried. The local chief is his cousin. Nothing ever happens. If you complain, they make life harder for you." Ethan nodded slowly. He'd seen this kind of setup before, a small circle of people protecting each other while the innocent suffered. After breakfast, he went to the mechanic's shop across the street. The man working there looked nervous but curious when Ethan introduced himself. "You're not a reporter, are you?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies in uniform." The mechanic hesitated, then said quietly, "You might want to be careful. That officer, he's got friends in town. They don't like outsiders asking questions." Ethan smiled. "I don't ask questions. I just observe." Over the next 2 days, he quietly gathered information. Small details, witness stories, patterns of abuse. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The officer was using his position to take what he wanted. He'd find people without proof, seize items, and pocket cash. But there was something else. It seemed he had plans to leave town soon, and he was trying to collect as much as he could before disappearing. On the third night, Ethan went back near the station. The same car was parked there, trunk half open. This time, the officer was inside, counting money under a dim light. Ethan approached slowly, his footsteps silent on the gravel. "Working late?" he said quietly. The officer turned sharply, hand near his holster. "Who the hell are you?" "Just someone who doesn't like thieves," Ethan said calmly. The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're talking to." "I do," Ethan replied. "A man hiding behind a badge. One who forgot what it means to wear it." The officer laughed harshly. "You think you can walk in here and lecture me? You're out of your mind." Ethan didn't move. His voice stayed calm. "You've got a chance to do one right thing. Turn yourself in. Tell the truth." "Not happening," the officer sneered. "People like me don't get caught." Ethan stepped closer, his tone firm but even. "Everyone gets caught. Some just take longer." The officer's expression changed, anger mixed with fear. "Get out of here before I make you." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to finish something that should have never started." He reached into his pocket and placed a small flash drive on the hood of the car. "Everything you've done. Every person you've taken from. It's all here." The officer's face went pale. How Ethan cut him off. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is what you do now. You can walk into that building and face it like a man, or you can keep running until someone else finds you. For a long moment, there was silence. The night air was still, and the only sound was the hum of the streetlight above. The officer's hand trembled. His voice broke slightly. "Who are you?" Ethan looked him in the eye. "Just someone who remembers what honor means." Then he turned and walked away. The next morning, the town woke up to news that the officer had resigned suddenly. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he left town, others said he confessed. No one knew for sure.